Hello YouTube. So over the last couple of weeks we've done quite a few modifications, especially to Artemis CP2, or you can also refer to it as the Diana Chaser. So yeah, basically what I'd like to do today, we're going to discuss some of the possible modifications that you can do to this. We're going to go through them in detail, and I'm going to share with you exactly how this works on the inside and why the modifications work. So let's get into it. Hope you enjoy this. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to show you how to take the gun apart, and then also basically not much tools you need, just a screwdriver and some Allen keys, and that's about it. So let's get going. So the first thing we're going to do, I've already removed the scope, so if you've got any other sights or whatever on there, just remove that. And we're going to start off by removing here. So this is just a 3mm Allen key. We're going to loosen up here. After we loosen up here, we can remove the stock. I like to just keep all the little bits and bobs in. Alright, so then to remove it, easy, just lift it in front and then pull it back. And there we go. There, the stock is off. Let's put that one side. So now basically what you can see there, we've got just the barrel and the CO2 chamber. So the next thing that we want to do is we're basically going to just remove this back screw here. Again, 3mm Allen key. So when we remove this screw, that's going to allow us to take out the hammer spring. Alright, so there you can see there's our hammer spring and hammer cap at the back. This one is the screw. Put that all in there. Then the next thing we want to do is we want to remove this this barrel here, where we basically are cocking our hammer spring. So alright, so the next step is to remove this little screw here. So you can just pull back the barrel, the bolt, and I'm just going to remove this tiny little screw that's in here. It's very small, so just make sure you don't lose it. Right, so there you see, small little screw. Alright, then the next step, we're going to just loosen off this barrel band here in front. Don't need to completely remove the screw. Just going to slide that forward. Now you'll see everything is starting to loosen up here. Alright, so there we have our breech port. Let's put this in here. Okay, so there we have our CO2 chamber. Inside here we've got our little valve that's operating the air. So next thing that we're going to do, we're just going to remove this on this little cap screw here. The reason we want to take this out is so that we can remove this hammer. So I'm just going to take take that off. Again, just be careful that you don't lose any of the parts. Alright, so now if we pull this trigger down, there we have our hammer. And basically your hammer spring goes in at the back there. Alright, so far so good. Then, okay, so the next step, we're going to remove this small little screw here, and this is just holding our little valve in place, the air valve. Okay, right, so to remove this valve, we're just going to knock it a bit. There you can see it's starting to come out the back. So let's just take an Allen key. You'll see it might get stuck here on your trigger, so just pull the trigger just to release that. Alright, and there she comes. Alright, so here we have our little air valve. So let's then look, how does this whole thing work? We'll put all of this together. How does it function? So basically this is sitting here inside. Then we've got our hammer, which sits here. We've got our hammer spring, which sits here at the back, like this. Okay, and then here we've got our breech, which basically sits on top here. Okay, so how this thing works, we put in a CO2 canister, it gets pierced in the front of this little valve there, alright, and then it starts to fill up this chamber inside here with air. Alright, if you look inside here, let's open up this valve. Alright, so there fills up, CO2 fills up this chamber here, and then inside here we've got a little spring, and we've got this little seat. You can see there it's got a little seat on it. So this basically just seals off so that the air stays inside this chamber, and then what happens, our hammer is going to knock onto the back of this valve, causing it to open just for a split second, just to overcome this spring that's inside here. And during that time the CO2 escapes through the breech into the back of the pellet, and once it overcomes the inertia of the pellet inside the barrel, then off your pellet goes. So how do we increase our feet per second? Well, very, very easily. There's three options that we have without needing to make irreversible changes. First option we have, which is the one that I went for, is we are basically going to pre-tension this hammer spring. So this hammer spring, if we measure it new, basically sitting at 75 millimeters. This is for a new hammer spring. So what we're going to do, we're going to insert a spacer, which basically then just allows us to be able to pre-tension. Alright, so what I've done last time to increase our feet per second is I inserted a small little spacer in here. Let's see if we can quickly remove it. actually received quite a number of questions about this spacer and the longevity of this spacer. Alright, so there you see, very small little spacer that we had installed there, and this spacer was basically made from a piece of rubber, and the outside diameter of this spacer is around about 10 millimeters, and the thickness of the spacer is 4 millimeters. So all this spacer was doing basically allowed us to pre-tension this spring with 4 millimeters, so thereby increasing the tension in the spring, which allows us this hammer then to hit this valve a little bit harder, which allows this valve to stay open for a couple of split seconds more, allows more gas through, and then allows us to have an increase in feet per second. Alright, so very simple, not too complicated. The next thing, so that's the first option that you have to increase your feet per second. Just insert a small little spacer into your hammer. Okay. The second option you have, which is not one that I really favor, is you can stretch. You can physically stretch this spring out, and basically by stretching this spring, what happens is you're creating more tension in the spring. So let's stretch this one out a little bit. So current, remember just now we measured it, it was 75 millimeters. So now it's sitting at 78. Let's go to 80 millimeters. And you can see how easy it is to stretch it just by hand, just gently. So one thing you just need to keep in mind, every time you make a modification to increase your feet per second, you're also going to be losing on your shot count. So now you can see this is been stretched out now. It's just on 80 millimeters. So there already we're going to have a little bit more feet per second. Alright, so like I said, first option to increase your feet per second is to put some spacers in the back of your hammer, which causes a pre-tension on your spring. Second option is to stretch out your spring a little bit, and if you do stretch it out, it is possible to stretch it back to its original size, which is 75 millimeters. So don't worry too much about that. If you really want to stretch it and try it, it is reversible. Then the other option that you have is to take this little spring that's inside your valve and replace it with a lighter spring. So a spring that will have basically less tension. So all that's happening is once this valve gets hit, if you've got less tension or less resistance on the inside, then it also means that your valve stays open a little bit longer, which also allows you to get more air through the air valve or CO2 valve, and more air into the back of your pellet, which basically relates to more feet per second. Just however, remember, whatever you do, you will lose on your shot count. So originally this Artemis CP2 had a shot count of about 40. I expect with these new modifications that I'm doing now, I'm probably going to go down to about 15 to 20 shots, and I'm going to see an increase in feet per second of probably around 100 feet per second. So yeah, just keep that in mind. You will definitely lose on shot count. Alright, so let's now reassemble it all again, and then we can test it out and see how our modifications went. So to reassemble, very simple. Just going to put our valve back. I will make another video which discusses other options which you can do to increase your feet per second. However, once you go down that road and you make those changes, you will not be able to reverse them. So these three that I've shown you are very reversible. You can put in a lighter spring, you can add some spaces into your hammer, and the other one is to stretch out your hammer spring. All three of these are definitely reversible. So if you want to play around a little bit, I would suggest that you do these first before you move on to the others. But I will make a video to show you which other modifications you can make to increase your feet per second, but we'll do that in a separate video. Alright, so there's our valve back together. What I'm going to do today, there was some questions around the longevity of this spacer. This is just a very hard rubber spacer. This rubber is usually used to seat taps. So there you can see that rubber still looks fine, and this is about 2 months that it's been in here, so you really don't need to worry about that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put it back in here. I'm going to add an extra one. So basically we're looking at now, we're going to have an 8 millimeters pre-tension. So this is 4 millimeters each. We've got 2 of them, which is going to give us 8 millimeters. Let's trim this one a little bit more. So let's put this in here. So there we can see nicely we've got our spacers in the back of our hammer there. Yeah, it's going to push in our hammer spring. Alright, there you go. It's easy as that. Alright, so the first thing we've got to do to reassemble here, we're going to push this valve back in. Also, whilst you've got your gun split, just have a look at the seal inside here. This is the seal that's going to seal on your CO2 cartridge when you push it in here, CO2 capsule, and then it seals on that rubber inside there. So if your rubber is worn, you can just replace that little rubber that's inside there, and it doesn't need to be with exactly the same. Even an O-ring will work as well, as long as it's a nice tight fit that it doesn't move around in there. Alright, so first thing we need to do, we're going to push this valve back in here. Remember you basically want to have the valve that it lines up here. Alright, so there you can see nicely how it lines up inside there. Alright, so that's so far so good. Then we're going to put back our screw which holds that valve in place. Okay, so there our valve is now back. So the next thing that we want to do is we're going to put our hammer back in place. So remember your trigger is going to be a little bit in the way, so just push your trigger in, put our hammer back in, and then remember we've got this screw that we removed at the back of the hammer here. So let's put that back. It's this little one with a little brass ring on the bottom, and this is basically what allows your when you are sliding your barrel back to cock your hammer spring, it's basically pushing on this little cap screw here. Let's just tighten this up a bit. Alright, so there you have it. Okay, then the next step, what we want to do, we want to put our barrel and hammer cocking mechanism here. Just remember, we've got this small little brass valve in here that's going to basically seat inside there, and then there's an O-ring at the top of that on our breech, and that needs to seat in there. Alright, so once that's all together, then we've got this tiny little screw we're going to put back in here. Right, let's tighten that up again. Alright, we can also put in our barrel band back together. Let's quickly tighten that one up. Okay, I'll also be doing a video later on which shows you how to basically tune your trigger a little bit, and I'll be showing that later on in another video, and that also helps you in terms of improving your accuracy, because the lighter your trigger, the less impact your trigger pull has on your shooting. So definitely that can increase your accuracy, but I'll show that in a separate video. Alright, then the next step that we want to have, or that we want to do, is we want to put back our hammer cap. And that's fairly simple. Just going to push it in here. Alright. Now before we completely reassemble, just want to check and make sure that everything is operating as it should. So let's quickly cock it here. There we see, close it, and then just have a dry fire. Alright, so far so good, everything sounds fine there. Last thing we're going to do is just to put back this. So if you look carefully here, you'll see your hammer cap has a small little notch here at the back, and that actually fits inside your stock, inside there. So if you look nicely there, you can see inside there. So that's the first part of putting your stock back together. Put the trigger in there, put the back inside. Alright, and then everything fits nicely in place. And the last thing we need to do is put this screw in place, which basically just going to hold our stock in place. Alright. Okay, and that's it. There we have our Artemis CP2 reassembled. Very, very simple modifications, nothing fancy, and all of it is reversible. So let's get out, let's shoot this a couple of times. Let's see if we've got a bit of an increase in our feet per second, and I'll be back with you shortly.